Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to the English Globe. It's wonderful to have you here with us today. This is the place where we explore the most important global stories while helping you improve your English listening and understanding skills. Whether you're learning English for school, work, or travel, our goal is to help you grow step by step through meaningful and interesting topics from around the world.
That's right, Adam. And today's episode is about one of the most talked about subjects in global economics: China's economic rise versus America's dominance, the trade war explained. This topic is not only about two countries competing, but also about how their actions influence the entire world, from the price of goods in your local market to the future of technology and international relations.
Exactly. We often hear about the trade war between the United States and China on the news, but many people, especially English learners, don't really understand what it means or why it happened. Today, we'll explain everything in simple and clear English. We'll explore how China became an economic superpower, how America has maintained its global leadership for decades, and what happens when these two powerful nations compete for global influence.
Before we dive deep into today's discussion, dear listeners, we kindly ask you to take a quick moment to support our work. If you enjoy educational podcasts and want to keep learning English with real-world stories, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the English Globe, and click the notification bell so you never miss our future episodes.
Yes, and we would love to hear from you. Please tell us in the comments where you're listening from. We have listeners from all around the world, from Asia to Europe, from Africa to America, and we'd love to know your thoughts. What do you think about the topic? Do you believe China is rising faster than America? Share your opinion below. Your comment might even be read in our next episode.
Now, let's begin by understanding why this topic is so important. The trade relationship between China and the United States is one of the largest and most influential in the world. These two countries together represent more than 1/3 of the world's total economy. That means when they cooperate, global growth becomes strong, and when they conflict, the effects can be felt everywhere, from your country's economy to your daily shopping costs.
That's a great point. For example, when the US and China place tariffs on each other's products, prices for everyday items like electronics, clothes, and food can increase. Companies may struggle, jobs may be affected, and the global stock markets can become unstable. So even if you live far away from both countries, their decisions still have a big impact on your life. That's what makes this topic so relevant to everyone listening today.
Another reason this discussion matters is that it helps us understand how the world economy works. Learning about trade, investment, and competition can give you a clearer picture of how nations develop and interact. For English learners, this is a perfect opportunity to learn useful words such as tariffs, exports, imports, trade deficit, and globalization. These terms often appear in international news, so understanding them can make you a more informed global citizen.
Yes, and we'll explain each of those words in a simple way throughout the episode. But before we do that, let's take a moment to reflect on how we got here. For many decades, the United States was the world's dominant economic power. Its technology, companies, and global currency gave it huge influence. But over the last 40 years, China has been growing at an incredible speed, lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and becoming the world's factory for goods of every kind.
Exactly. From toys to smartphones, clothes to cars, many of the products we use every day are made in China. This manufacturing strength gave China an enormous advantage in global trade. Meanwhile, the US focused more on innovation, technology, and finance. For a long time, this system worked well. China produced, America consumed, and the world economy benefited. But eventually, the balance began to change. And that's where tension started.
You're absolutely right. When China's economy began to challenge America's dominance, both sides started to compete more aggressively. The U.S. accused China of unfair trade practices, such as selling goods too cheaply or protecting its local industries with government help. China, on the other hand, said the U.S. was trying to block its growth and stop it from reaching its full potential as a modern global power.
And that competition slowly turned into what we now call a trade war. It's important to remember, though, that this is not a traditional war with weapons and armies. Instead, it's an economic war, a conflict fought with tariffs, regulations, and restrictions that affect companies, workers, and consumers. Understanding this helps us realize how powerful economies can shape the modern world without even firing a single shot.
And what makes this topic so fascinating, Julia, is that it's not only about economics, it's also about politics, technology, and ideology. On one side, the United States believes in free markets and private enterprise. On the other side, China's government plays a strong role in directing its economy and supporting its industries. These two different systems are now competing for global influence in Asia, Africa, Europe, and even cyberspace.
That's right. And in today's interconnected world, this competition affects every nation and every person. The smartphone you're holding, the clothes you wear, and even the prices of fuel or food are all influenced by this economic relationship. That's why learning about it is so valuable. It gives us a clearer understanding of how deeply connected our lives are to global events and why every economic decision by these superpowers matters.
So, throughout this podcast, we'll carefully explore each part of the story: how China rose to become an economic giant, how America built and maintained its dominance, what caused the trade war, and what it means for the future of global trade and cooperation. We'll use simple English to make sure you can follow along easily, even if you're just starting your English learning journey.
And don't forget, dear listeners, that this is not just a story about politics or economics. It's also a lesson about human ambition, progress, and competition. It's a story about how nations grow, adapt, and struggle for influence in a fast-changing world. By understanding this topic, you'll not only improve your English, but also develop a deeper understanding of how our global community works.
So make sure to stay with us till the end of this episode. We promise that by the time we finish, you'll have a much clearer idea of what the US-China trade war is really about, why it started, and what lessons we can all learn from it. And once again, please like this video, subscribe to the English Globe, and share your opinion in the comments. Your support means a lot to us, and it helps our growing community of English learners stay connected and inspired.
Perfectly said, Adam. Now that we've introduced the topic and set the stage for this global rivalry, let's go back in time and explore how China's economic rise actually began. Understanding the history behind China's growth will help us see why the trade war became such a major global issue. To really understand the trade war between the United States and China, we need to go back in time and look at how China's economic rise began. It's not something that happened overnight. It's a story that started more than 40 years ago when China was a very different country. Much poorer, much less connected to the outside world, and still recovering from years of internal struggle.
That's true. In the late 1970s, China was facing enormous economic challenges. The country was mostly rural, with most people working on farms and earning very little money. Industrial production was low, international trade was almost non-existent, and the nation's economy was under a strict communist system that did not allow private business or foreign investment.
But then came a major turning point. In 1978, a new leader named Deng Xiaoping introduced a series of reforms that would change China forever. He called them reform and opening up. These reforms allowed people to start their own small businesses, let farmers sell their crops in markets, and opened certain cities to foreign companies that wanted to invest and build factories.
Yes, and that was a historic decision. Deng Xiaoping once famously said, "It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." What he meant was that it didn't matter if an idea came from capitalism or socialism. If it helped the country grow, it was worth trying. That simple but powerful idea completely changed the direction of China's economy and made it one of the most remarkable transformations in modern history.
At first, the change was slow, but by the 1980s and 1990s, China's economy began to grow faster than almost any other country. New factories appeared, cities expanded, and millions of people moved from rural areas to urban centers looking for better jobs. Foreign companies, especially from the United States, Japan, and Europe, began investing heavily in China because the labor costs were low and production efficiency was high.
Exactly. This created what economists call the world's factory. China became the global center for manufacturing, producing everything from clothes, toys, and electronics to furniture and machinery. The country's ports, highways, and railways expanded rapidly, turning China into a major hub of international trade. For example, cities like Shenzhen, which were once small fishing towns, grew into massive industrial and technological centers.
One of the most important moments came in 2001 when China joined the World Trade Organization, often known as the WTO. This step opened the door for even greater trade and investment opportunities. It allowed China to sell its products to more countries without facing high tariffs and restrictions. This decision helped China integrate deeply into the global economy and made it an essential player in international trade.
That's right. After joining the WTO, China's exports exploded. Factories began producing not only for domestic use, but also for major Western brands. If you looked at almost any product label during that time, you would often see 3 words: Made in China. It became a symbol of the country's global presence in manufacturing. By the mid-2000s, China was exporting goods to every corner of the world, and its economy was growing by nearly 10% every year.
However, this rapid growth also came with challenges. Millions of people moved to cities, creating huge urban populations. The demand for housing, transportation, and public services increased dramatically. At the same time, China faced issues such as environmental pollution, income inequality, and labor conditions. But despite those difficulties, the country continued to push forward, focusing on modernization and innovation.
Another key reason behind China's success was its ability to learn from others. Chinese engineers and entrepreneurs studied how Western industries worked, adopted modern technologies, and often improved them. The government also played a strong role by planning long-term development strategies, building new infrastructure, supporting education, and encouraging research in science and technology.
And we should also remember the role of education. China began investing heavily in schools, universities, and technical training centers. The government believed that economic growth needed skilled people who could work with new technology and develop modern industries. As a result, millions of young students began studying engineering, mathematics, and science, subjects that later helped China dominate fields like manufacturing, robotics, and information technology.
Another part of China's success story is its population size. With more than 1.4 billion people, China had a huge labor force. This gave it a big advantage over smaller countries. Global companies saw this as an opportunity. They could produce goods cheaply and quickly in China and then sell them worldwide. Over time, this created jobs, lifted millions of people out of poverty, and built a strong middle class that began buying more products, including international brands.
Exactly. And as the Chinese middle class grew, so did the domestic market. China was no longer just a country that produced goods for export. It also became a major consumer of global products. International car companies, fashion brands, and technology firms started focusing on China's market because of its growing number of customers with strong purchasing power.
By the 2010s, China had become the world's second-largest economy, just behind the United States. This transformation was one of the fastest in human history. In only 4 decades, China moved from being an isolated and low-income country to becoming an industrial and technological superpower. Its success became a model that many developing countries wanted to follow.
But with that success came new challenges. The United States, which had been the dominant economic power for decades, began to see China's rise as a potential threat to its leadership. American companies were facing strong competition from Chinese firms, and the trade gap between the two nations was growing rapidly. In simple terms, the US was buying far more from China than China was buying from the US, creating what is called a trade deficit.
That trade deficit became one of the key reasons for growing tension between the two countries. Many American workers and politicians began to worry that China's rise was happening at the cost of American jobs. They argued that U.S. industries were suffering because companies moved their production to China to save money. On the other hand, China argued that its growth was based on hard work, innovation, and smart planning, not unfair practices.
This difference in views eventually led to frustration, suspicion, and finally confrontation. But before we move to the trade war itself, it's important to appreciate just how far China had come. From a closed economy to a global powerhouse, its journey was shaped by vision, discipline, and determination. It's a reminder that economic growth takes time, planning, and a willingness to change.
Well said, Julia. China's story shows that no nation's position in the world is permanent. Economic power can shift, just like history itself. What makes this story even more interesting is that while China was rising, the United States was still maintaining its global dominance through innovation, education, and finance. To fully understand the trade war, we also need to understand how America built that dominance in the first place.
Exactly. In our next section, we'll explore the fascinating story of how the United States became the world's leading economic power, from the post-World War II era to the rise of Silicon Valley and the global dominance of the US dollar. Understanding that history will help us see why the trade rivalry between these two nations became so intense.
To understand the trade war and global competition between the United States and China, we first need to explore how America became the world's leading economic power. The story of American dominance begins after World War II, a time when most of the world was rebuilding from destruction, and the United States emerged stronger than ever. Its factories, industries, and infrastructure were intact, and it held enormous amounts of gold and resources compared to other nations.
Exactly. After 1945, the world was exhausted from years of war. Many countries in Europe and Asia were deeply damaged, but the United States had not only survived, it had thrived. During the war, America's industries produced weapons, machinery, vehicles, and technology that made it the manufacturing center of the world. After the war ended, those same factories turned their attention toward consumer goods like cars, radios, refrigerators, and later, televisions.
And with this industrial strength came financial dominance. In 1944, during the final stages of World War II, world leaders met at a conference in a place called Bretton Woods in the United States. There they agreed that the American dollar would become the world's main currency for trade and finance. This agreement gave the United States an enormous advantage because other countries began to hold U.S. dollars as reserves, use them in trade, and trust in the stability of the American economy.
Yes, and that trust became the foundation of global trade for decades. The US dollar was backed by gold at the time, which gave it even more credibility. Countries that needed loans for rebuilding, such as Germany, Japan, and France, looked to the United States for financial help. America supported the reconstruction of Europe through the Marshall Plan, a massive economic aid program that helped restore industries, rebuild cities, and create strong political alliances.
That period also marked the beginning of what many economists call the American century. The United States became not only an economic superpower, but also a political and cultural one. American companies spread across the world, American universities attracted international students, and American technology began shaping everyday life. Products like Coca-Cola, Ford cars, Levi's jeans, and later, computers from IBM became symbols of modern progress and global influence.
It's fascinating to see how innovation became one of America's greatest strengths. During the 1950s and 1960s, the United States invested heavily in research, science, and education. The government supported programs that developed new technologies, from the first satellites in space to advanced computer systems. This spirit of innovation helped create world-changing companies such as Microsoft, Apple, and Intel, which would later define the modern digital age.
And don't forget the role of the American dream, the idea that anyone, regardless of background, could succeed through hard work and creativity. This belief inspired generations of inventors, scientists, and entrepreneurs to build new industries and take risks. Silicon Valley, located in California, became the heart of global innovation, producing technology that changed how people work, communicate, and live.
Another major factor in America's rise was its strong system of democracy and rule of law. These provided stability and encouraged investment from both domestic and foreign sources. People trusted that their businesses and ideas would be protected. This stability, combined with access to capital and a culture that rewarded innovation, made the United States a magnet for talented individuals from all over the world.
That's a great point. Immigration played a big role in America's success. Many of the scientists, engineers, and entrepreneurs who shaped modern industries were immigrants or children of immigrants. They brought fresh ideas, different experiences, and a desire to succeed. This diversity of minds gave the United States a unique edge in science, technology, and creativity, something that continues to this day.
At the same time, America's global leadership also depended on its alliances. After World War II, the US helped create major international institutions such as the United Nations, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. These organizations were designed to maintain peace, promote development, and stabilize global trade. By leading these institutions, the US positioned itself at the center of the New World Order, guiding the direction of international policy and economics.
During the Cold War, which lasted from the late 1940s to the early 1990s, America faced strong competition from the Soviet Union, but that rivalry was mostly political and military. In terms of economy, the United States remained unmatched. Its companies expanded globally, its currency dominated world trade, and its people enjoyed a standard of living that was higher than almost anywhere else on Earth.
Indeed. And what's interesting is that even after the Cold War ended, America's influence only grew stronger. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the United States became the world's only superpower, both politically and economically. The 1990s were known as a decade of American globalization. Free trade agreements like NAFTA and the growth of international companies such as Google, Amazon, and Microsoft made the US the hub of global commerce and technology.
Yes, and this dominance was supported by the power of the dollar. Because the US dollar was used everywhere, from oil trading to international banking, America could easily influence global finance. Central banks around the world held US dollars as reserves, which gave the United States a level of control and stability that no other country could match. This made America the financial heartbeat of the global economy.
But of course, with great power comes responsibility, and sometimes overconfidence. While America enjoyed decades of economic leadership, some industries began to face new challenges. Manufacturing jobs started moving overseas to countries where production costs were lower. This process, called outsourcing, allowed companies to save money but also led to job losses for many American workers. And one of the biggest destinations for outsourced production was, you guessed it, China.
That's a very important observation. As China opened its doors to the world and began building a strong manufacturing base, many American companies saw an opportunity. They could produce goods in China at a much lower cost and then sell them globally at higher profits. This arrangement worked well for a while. American consumers got cheaper products, companies earned more money, and China's economy grew rapidly. But over time, it created an imbalance that would later lead to tension.
Exactly. The trade relationship that once seemed mutually beneficial slowly started to cause problems. America's trade deficit with China, meaning it was importing far more than it was exporting, became a growing concern. Some US leaders began to argue that China was gaining too much economic power and using unfair trade practices, such as keeping its currency value low or supporting local industries with government help.
And that's where the story starts to connect with the present. While the United States continued to lead in innovation, technology, and finance, China's rapid industrial rise began to challenge that dominance. The world was entering a new kind of competition, one not defined by war or ideology, but by economics, trade, and technology.
The US still had enormous strengths, a powerful military, the world's leading universities, and some of the biggest tech companies in history. But China was catching up fast. It was no longer just producing low-cost goods. It was building advanced products, developing new technologies, and investing heavily in areas like artificial intelligence, 5G networks, and renewable energy.
This marked the beginning of a new global reality, one where two giants stood face to face, each with its own vision for the future. On one side was the United States, representing decades of dominance through innovation and free markets. On the other was China, a rising power with a state-led economic model focused on long-term strategy and rapid growth. The world was now watching closely to see what would happen next.
And that brings us to the roots of the US-China trade war. To truly understand why tensions began rising and how they turned into one of the most important economic conflicts of the modern era, we'll explore in the next section the early signs of disagreement, from tariffs and trade deficits to accusations of unfair competition.
So stay tuned, dear listeners, because in the next part, we'll uncover how this peaceful economic partnership slowly transformed into a fierce trade rivalry. We'll explain what a trade war really means, how it affects countries around the world, and why it matters to every global citizen. To understand how the US-China trade war started, we must first look at the trade relationship between the two countries. For decades, the United States has bought far more goods from China than it sold to them. This situation created what economists call a trade deficit, meaning the U.S. was importing much more than it was exporting. Many American politicians believed this imbalance was unfair and harmful because it sent money and jobs out of the country while helping China grow stronger and richer.
Yes, Adam, that trade deficit became one of the main reasons for rising tension. American leaders felt that China was taking advantage of global trade rules. The US accused China of keeping its currency low to make exports cheaper, and of not giving American companies the same market access that Chinese firms enjoyed in the United States. This imbalance made many in Washington believe that the trade system was not equal and needed serious reform to protect American industries and workers.
Another major issue was intellectual property theft. This means ideas, designs, or technology created by one company are copied or used by another without permission. Many U.S. businesses claimed that Chinese companies were using their inventions without paying for them. American officials also argued that Chinese laws forced foreign companies to share their technology if they wanted to do business in China. This, they said, gave Chinese companies unfair advantages in high-tech industries like electronics and telecommunications.
That's right. And it didn't stop there. Many US officials also said that China's government was heavily supporting its own companies through subsidies, money given to help local businesses compete globally. When a government helps companies lower their prices, they can sell goods more cheaply around the world. The US believed this hurt fair competition because American companies had to play by different rules, without that kind of government support. This made tensions rise even further between the two sides.
All these concerns eventually pushed the U.S. government to act. In 2018, under President Donald Trump, Washington launched a series of tariffs on Chinese imports. A tariff is a special tax placed on goods coming from another country. The idea was simple: make Chinese products more expensive so that people in the U.S. would buy American goods instead. The goal was to reduce the trade deficit and pressure China to change its trade and technology policies.
China, of course, didn't stay quiet. They quickly responded by placing their own tariffs on American goods, such as soybeans, cars, and energy products. This back and forth created a chain reaction that affected companies, farmers, and consumers in both countries. Prices started to rise, supply chains were disrupted, and markets became more unstable. What began as a dispute over trade rules slowly turned into a much larger struggle over who would lead the global economy in the future.
The trade war was not only about money, it was also about power, technology, and influence. Both countries wanted to protect their national interests. For the United States, it was about keeping its global leadership in innovation and production. For China, it was about defending its right to grow and compete on the world stage. These deep differences made it difficult to find common ground, and that's why the conflict continued for several years.
And even though there were negotiations and temporary agreements, the tension never fully disappeared. The trade war exposed the reality that both nations were not just trade partners. They were rivals with different goals and systems. It changed how countries around the world viewed globalization and made many realize how deeply connected, yet politically divided, the global economy had become.
Now that we've understood why the trade war began, let's move to one of its most powerful and visible tools: tariffs. In simple English, a tariff is a tax that a country places on goods coming from another country. For example, if the United States puts a tariff on Chinese electronics, it means that when those products enter the U.S., importers must pay extra money to the government. This makes Chinese goods more expensive in American stores. The main goal is to make people buy more local products instead of foreign ones. Tariffs have been used throughout history to protect local industries, but in this case, they became weapons in a modern economic battle between the world's two largest economies.
That's right, Adam. When President Trump's administration introduced tariffs on Chinese goods in 2018, they targeted hundreds of products, from steel and aluminum to clothing, electronics, and machinery. The total value of these tariffs reached hundreds of billions of dollars. China quickly responded by placing its own tariffs on American goods like soybeans, cars, and airplanes. This back and forth became known as the tit-for-tat strategy, when both sides keep responding to each other's moves. It created uncertainty in global trade and affected not just these two countries, but also businesses and markets all over the world.
The idea behind the tariffs was simple: to protect American jobs and industries by making imported goods more expensive. However, in reality, the situation was much more complicated. When tariffs are applied, companies that import goods have to pay more money to bring them in. Most of the time, those companies don't absorb the cost themselves. Instead, they raise the prices for consumers. This means that ordinary people, not the government or the companies, often end up paying more when they buy products affected by tariffs. So instead of helping everyone, tariffs sometimes made daily life more expensive for Americans, buying phones, clothes, or even cars that contain Chinese-made parts.
Yes, and the impact on American farmers was especially painful. China was one of the biggest buyers of U.S. agricultural products, especially soybeans. But when China imposed tariffs in response, it reduced its imports of American crops. This left many US farmers struggling to find new buyers for their harvests. Prices for soybeans dropped sharply, and many farmers across the Midwest faced serious financial losses. The US government eventually provided billions of dollars in aid to support them. But for many families, the damage was already done. This shows how global trade decisions can deeply affect local communities far away from government offices or business centers.
Meanwhile, China also felt the pressure. Many of its manufacturing companies depend on exports to the US for survival. When tariffs hit, the demand for Chinese goods started to fall. Factories faced lower production, workers lost jobs, and some smaller businesses closed. The Chinese government tried to reduce the impact by supporting local industries, cutting taxes, and encouraging companies to sell more goods in other markets like Southeast Asia, Africa, and Europe. Still, the uncertainty of the trade war slowed China's economic growth for the first time in years.
The ripple effects went far beyond these two countries. Europe and Asia were caught in the middle of the trade conflict. European companies that supplied parts to Chinese factories suddenly lost orders. Asian economies like South Korea, Vietnam, and Malaysia also felt the tension because they were part of the same production chains that connected China and the US. When trade between these two giants slowed down, global supply chains were disrupted. Prices for raw materials, electronics, and even food changed across continents. It became clear that when two major economies fight, the whole world feels the shockwaves.
Exactly, Julia. And the developing nations were also deeply affected. Many smaller countries rely on stable trade between the US and China to sell their own goods or buy affordable products. When tariffs made everything more expensive, those countries faced higher costs too. For example, factories in Africa or South America that depended on Chinese machinery or American tools had to pay more, which slowed their industries. The trade war showed how connected our world really is, how decisions made in Washington or Beijing can influence jobs, prices, and opportunities in faraway places.
Another important side of the story is how companies reacted. Many businesses tried to move their factories out of China to avoid tariffs. Some shifted production to countries like Vietnam, Thailand, or India. This trend was called supply chain diversification, meaning companies didn't want to depend on one country too much. However, moving factories isn't easy. It takes time, money, and skilled labor. So, for many businesses, the trade war brought chaos and confusion. Some faced losses, others found new opportunities, but almost everyone had to rethink how they operated in the global market.
The financial markets also reacted strongly. Investors hate uncertainty, and the trade war created a lot of it. Stock markets around the world went up and down based on news about negotiations or tariff announcements. Big companies, especially in technology and manufacturing, saw their values change overnight. Even though the trade war was about goods and taxes, it also influenced currencies, stock prices, and investment decisions. It reminded everyone that in our globalized world, economics and politics are deeply connected. One decision in trade policy can shake economies everywhere.
Yes, and for English learners, this situation is a great example of how economic vocabulary connects with real-life events. Words like tariffs, imports, exports, and trade deficit aren't just terms in a textbook. They describe things that shape people's daily lives. The trade war wasn't only about governments or businesses, it affected workers, farmers, students, and consumers worldwide. It changed how countries thought about globalization and how they planned for the future.
Absolutely. The story of tariffs and their global impact teaches us that economics is not just numbers, it's about people. Every trade decision creates winners and losers. When one country tries to protect its industries, another one might suffer. And in the end, cooperation often works better than confrontation. The trade war between the US and China showed how fragile our global connections can be. and how important it is for nations to find balance between competition and partnership.
Well said, Adam. The tariffs may have started as tools for negotiation, but they turned into symbols of deeper economic rivalry. Both the United States and China learned hard lessons about how dependent they were on each other. And the rest of the world realized that no economy can stand alone in today's global system. The trade war changed the way countries think about trade, technology, and power, and it's still influencing world politics today. As we move forward in our discussion of the US-China rivalry, it's impossible to ignore the role of technology. In the 21st century, economic power isn't just about manufacturing or trade volumes. It's about innovation, research, and advanced technologies that shape the future. One of the most talked about examples is Huawei, China's telecommunications giant. Huawei became a global leader in building 5G networks, which are the next generation of mobile communication. The speed, efficiency, and connectivity of 5G technology are crucial for modern industries, smart cities, autonomous vehicles, and even artificial intelligence applications.
Exactly, Julia. The United States and many of its allies saw Huawei's global expansion as a potential threat to security and technological leadership. American officials argued that if Huawei equipment was used widely, it could give the Chinese government access to critical communication networks. Beyond security concerns, the rise of Huawei symbolized a larger issue. China was rapidly closing the technology gap with the US. After decades of American dominance in sectors like semiconductors, software, and telecommunications, China began producing advanced technology at a competitive pace, challenging the idea that the US could remain unopposed in global innovation.
And it's not only about telecommunications. China has invested massively in semiconductors, which are the brains of all modern electronics. From smartphones and laptops to electric cars and military equipment, semiconductors are essential. The US leads in semiconductor design, but China has been striving to produce more of these chips domestically. By reducing reliance on foreign suppliers, China wants to secure its technology supply chain and strengthen its global competitiveness. This ambition is part of a long-term plan known as Made in China 2025, which focuses on high-tech industries, including robotics, aerospace, renewable energy, and artificial intelligence.
At the same time, America has been determined to protect its technological edge. US companies like Apple, Intel, Microsoft, and Google are not only economic powerhouses, but also global leaders in innovation. The US government has taken measures to restrict China's access to advanced technology, such as limiting exports of semiconductors and certain software. The aim is to ensure that China cannot overtake the US in industries that are critical for national security and global economic leadership. This strategy, however, has led to tensions and forced companies around the world to rethink how they share technology across borders.
China's approach has been equally ambitious. The country invests heavily in artificial intelligence, renewable energy, quantum computing, and electric vehicles. Chinese tech companies like Baidu, Tencent, and Alibaba are developing sophisticated AI systems for finance, healthcare, transportation, and e-commerce. At the same time, China is building the world's largest renewable energy infrastructure, including solar panels, wind farms, and electric vehicles. These investments are not only about economic growth, but also about gaining influence in global technology standards and shaping the future of innovation.
It's fascinating because the competition isn't just economic, it's also strategic. Whoever leads in technology will have advantages in military capabilities, communication networks, and even the global digital economy. 5G networks, for instance, are more than just faster mobile internet. They allow smart cities to function, enable autonomous vehicles to operate safely, and support advanced healthcare systems. If a country controls this infrastructure, it can influence standards and regulations worldwide, creating both economic and political leverage.
That's why Huawei became such a symbol of the technological rivalry. Countries around the world faced difficult choices. Should they adopt Chinese 5G technology, which is cost-effective and advanced, or rely on Western alternatives? These decisions were influenced not only by cost and performance, but also by security concerns, geopolitical pressure, and long-term strategy. The US even encouraged its allies, including European countries and Japan, to avoid using Huawei equipment for critical infrastructure, highlighting how technology is now a major front in international politics.
Another interesting aspect is the semiconductor industry. The United States remains dominant in designing the most advanced chips, but China is rapidly increasing its production capacity. The country has created investment funds, research programs, and incentives to encourage domestic chip manufacturing. At the same time, American companies continue to innovate, creating chips that power artificial intelligence, high-performance computing, and advanced electronics. This battle for semiconductors represents a technological race that could determine global leadership for decades.
And artificial intelligence is another field where the competition is intense. AI systems can automate factories, improve medical diagnoses, manage logistics, and even assist in military planning. Both countries understand that AI is not just a technology, but a tool for national power. China has set ambitious goals to become a global AI leader by 2030, while the US continues to develop cutting-edge AI research through universities, private companies, and government agencies. This race influences investments, education, and international cooperation in technology.
Renewable energy is also part of the story. China dominates the production of solar panels, wind turbines, and electric vehicle batteries. By leading in renewable energy, China can not only reduce its environmental impact, but also shape global markets for energy technology. The United States, while a pioneer in many areas, faces competition from China in both production and innovation. This adds another layer to the trade war because energy technology is directly linked to economic growth and international influence.
Overall, technology has become a central battleground in the US-China rivalry. It is no longer just about trade deficits or tariffs. It's about who sets global standards, controls critical infrastructure, and shapes the future of innovation. Both nations are investing heavily in research, education, and advanced manufacturing to secure an advantage. This competition affects companies, governments, and consumers worldwide, and it shows that the global economy in the 21st century is driven not only by goods and money, but also by knowledge, creativity, and technological leadership.
Exactly. The battle for innovation teaches us that in today's world, economic power and technological leadership are inseparable. Who leads in AI, 5G, semiconductors, and renewable energy will influence global trade, security, and development for decades to come. This makes the US-China rivalry more than just a trade war. It is a struggle for the future itself, where ideas, research, and advanced industries are as important as factories, exports, or tariffs.
And for global citizens and English learners listening today, this story demonstrates how economics, politics, and technology are interconnected. By understanding the technological race, we can see why governments make certain decisions and how those decisions impact businesses, students, workers, and everyday life. Technology is shaping the 21st century, and this rivalry shows just how powerful innovation can be in redefining the world order. As we continue exploring the US-China trade war, it's important to remember that the effects didn't stay limited to these two countries. The whole world felt the impact. Europe, for example, experienced significant economic pressure. European companies often supply components to Chinese factories or sell products to both China and the United States. When tariffs disrupted trade between the two superpowers, European businesses faced uncertainty. Orders slowed down, supply chains became unpredictable, and costs increased. This forced companies in Germany, France, and Italy to rethink their strategies and find new ways to remain competitive in the global market.
Absolutely, Julia. Japan was also deeply affected by the trade war. Many Japanese manufacturers export electronics, automobiles, and machinery to both China and the United States. When tariffs increased and demand slowed, Japanese companies faced losses and had to adjust production schedules. Some even relocated parts of their supply chains to Southeast Asia to reduce costs and avoid the uncertainty caused by tariffs. The trade war showed countries like Japan that depending too heavily on one or two markets could be risky, which led them to consider diversifying their trade relationships.
Developing countries felt the ripple effects too. Nations in Southeast Asia, Africa, and South America rely on global trade to grow their economies. Many of these countries export raw materials, food, and manufactured goods to China and the United States. When trade slowed between the superpowers, demand for these products decreased and prices dropped. For example, farmers in Brazil and Argentina who sell soybeans to China saw lower revenues when tariffs disrupted global supply chains. Similarly, small manufacturers in Vietnam and Malaysia faced rising costs for imported materials.
One interesting consequence of the trade war is that it pushed countries to form new alliances and seek alternative trade partners. Businesses and governments realized that relying heavily on China or the US could be risky. Some countries started negotiating free trade agreements with other nations or regional organizations. Southeast Asian nations, for example, strengthened economic cooperation through agreements like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP. Latin American countries began exploring new markets in Asia and Africa. These moves show how global economic competition can reshape alliances and trade networks around the world.
Yes, and the trade war also encouraged countries to invest in domestic industries and reduce dependence on imports. For instance, some European nations increased support for local technology and manufacturing sectors to protect themselves from shocks caused by global conflicts. Similarly, developing countries began building infrastructure and industries to meet internal demand instead of relying entirely on exports. These strategies were not just about economics, they were about resilience, security, and long-term sustainability in a world where two superpowers could suddenly change the rules of trade.
The global reactions also highlighted a broader lesson. No country is truly isolated in today's economy. Even nations that are not directly involved in the US-China trade war felt consequences through markets, supply chains, and investment flows. This interconnectedness made governments more cautious and strategic, pushing them to diversify not only trade partners, but also sources of critical goods like electronics, medical supplies, and energy.
Another effect was that some countries acted as mediators or neutral partners in trade disputes. For example, the European Union often expressed concern about tariffs, but encouraged dialogue and negotiation rather than confrontation. Countries like Switzerland, Singapore, and the United Arab Emirates used their positions as trade hubs to facilitate business between American and Chinese companies. This showed how smaller or neutral nations could play an important role in maintaining stability in global trade, even when the world's two largest economies were in conflict.
It's also important to note that the trade war created opportunities for some countries. When tariffs made Chinese or American goods more expensive, businesses in other nations could offer alternatives at lower costs. For example, Vietnam, India, and Mexico gained new business as companies looked for more affordable production locations. Similarly, African nations exporting raw materials saw new opportunities as global supply chains shifted. In this way, a conflict between two superpowers indirectly shaped economic growth for other regions.
Ultimately, the global reactions to the trade war show how interconnected the modern world has become. Decisions made in Washington or Beijing don't just affect those two countries, They influence markets, jobs, and daily life across Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The trade war forced countries to be more strategic, think long-term, and explore new partnerships. It also reminded the world that when the biggest economies compete, everyone else must adapt to survive and thrive.
Exactly. For global citizens, this is a clear lesson in economic awareness. Trade conflicts are not just about politics or numbers. They touch every part of our lives. Prices, jobs, technology, and access to goods can all be affected by disputes between large nations. Understanding how other countries react and adapt helps us see the bigger picture and prepare for the changes that global trade conflicts can bring.
And for English learners, following this section teaches you how international issues are discussed clearly and simply. Words like tariffs, alliance, diversify, and supply chain are not just vocabulary. They are tools for understanding the real world. The global reaction to the trade war is a perfect example of how economics, politics, and society are all connected in today's interconnected world. As we continue, let's explore an important question. Who actually won and who lost during the US-China trade war? While it may seem like one country could clearly come out ahead, the reality is much more complex. In the short term, some countries benefited by filling gaps left by China or the United States. For example, Southeast Asian nations such as Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia became alternative manufacturing hubs. Companies seeking to avoid tariffs started moving production to these countries, which created new jobs, attracted foreign investment, and boosted local economies. These nations saw a temporary economic advantage as global supply chains shifted to meet changing trade conditions.
That's an excellent point, Julia. At the same time, both China and the United States faced serious challenges. In the U.S., farmers and manufacturers were among the hardest hit. American soybean farmers, for instance, lost one of their largest buyers when China imposed tariffs on agricultural products. Factories producing steel, aluminum, and machinery experienced reduced demand, and some small businesses struggled to absorb higher costs for imported materials. On the Chinese side, manufacturers experienced lower export volumes, factory closures, and declining profits. Although China's government provided financial support to companies, the trade war slowed economic growth and created uncertainty for businesses and investors.
The impact on prices was also significant. Tariffs raised the cost of imported goods, and in most cases, companies passed these costs on to consumers. This meant that Americans buying electronics, clothing, or machinery faced higher prices. Similarly, Chinese consumers saw price increases for products that relied on imported components from the US or other countries affected by the trade war. Rising prices affected household budgets and reduced purchasing power, showing that even ordinary people who were not directly involved in international trade felt the consequences of these policies.
Investments were another area heavily impacted. Companies dislike uncertainty, and the back-and-forth nature of the trade war created an unstable business environment. Many firms delayed expansion, postponed hiring, or held back on research and development spending. This slowdown affected long-term economic growth for both countries. For China, it also meant that some technology projects and industrial plans were postponed. For the U.S., companies that relied on international markets for growth had to reconsider supply chains and strategies, which also slowed investment and innovation.
However, some countries gained opportunities beyond Southeast Asia. Mexico, India, and certain Eastern European nations attracted companies looking to diversify their manufacturing locations. This created new jobs, expanded industrial capacity, and opened doors for economic growth. In addition, some global consumers had access to a wider variety of products because companies sought alternatives in new markets. These gains, however, were uneven and temporary because global trade is constantly shifting and can be affected by many political and economic decisions.
On the other hand, neither the US nor China came out entirely unscathed. The trade war disrupted long-term strategic planning, slowed global supply chains, and affected confidence in markets worldwide. Businesses in both countries faced higher costs, reduced sales, and difficulty forecasting demand. Even if some companies were protected by government policies or subsidies, the uncertainty itself created a cost. Economists often say that prolonged trade wars reduce efficiency, lower growth rates, and make global economic recovery slower and more difficult.
It's also worth noting that the effects were uneven within each country. Large corporations with international networks and resources were often better equipped to absorb shocks, while smaller businesses struggled to survive. Similarly, workers in some industries faced layoffs or reduced wages, while others in sectors like technology or alternative manufacturing hubs gained opportunities. This uneven impact shows that trade wars are rarely simple. The consequences ripple across different layers of society in ways that are sometimes hard to predict.
Looking at the long-term perspective, the trade war highlighted a strategic shift in the global economy. Countries realized the importance of diversifying trade partners and supply chains. Both China and the US have continued to invest heavily in technology, domestic industries, and international partnerships to reduce future vulnerabilities. The conflict also forced other nations to reassess their position in the global market, encouraging them to pursue policies that enhance economic resilience and competitiveness.
So, in summary, the trade war created both winners and losers. Southeast Asian countries and alternative manufacturing hubs gained short-term benefits, while both the US and China faced challenges to their economies, businesses, and consumers. Prices rose, investments slowed, and global growth was affected. At the same time, the conflict prompted countries around the world to adapt, diversify trade, and strengthen domestic industries, illustrating the complex ripple effects of such an economic confrontation.
Exactly. The story of winners and losers teaches us that in global trade, there are rarely clear-cut victories. Every decision has consequences for industries, workers, consumers, and international partners. Understanding these dynamics helps us see why economic policies matter so much and why trade wars are about more than numbers. They are about real people, real businesses, and the long-term balance of global power.
And for English learners, this section gives practical insights into economic vocabulary, such as diversify, supply chains, investment, tariffs, and economic growth. It also shows how global conflicts influence everyday life, making abstract concepts like trade war concrete and understandable.
As we reach this stage of our discussion, it's important to reflect on the bigger picture. The US-China trade war offers several lessons about globalization, nationalism, and interdependence. In a globalized world, countries are deeply connected through trade, technology, finance, and culture. Actions taken by one nation often have ripple effects worldwide, influencing jobs, prices, and growth in many other countries. At the same time, nationalism, the idea of prioritizing one's own country over global cooperation, played a major role in the trade war. Governments sought to protect local industries, jobs, and technology, sometimes at the expense of international collaboration.
Yes, Adam, and one of the main lessons is that interdependence is both a strength and a vulnerability. When nations rely on each other for trade, investment, or technology, they benefit from efficiency and innovation. However, they also become sensitive to conflicts and disruptions. The trade war showed how quickly global supply chains, markets, and economies can be affected by disagreements between major powers. It taught governments, companies, and even individuals that while global cooperation can drive growth, overdependence on a single country or market can create risks.
This raises a critical question for the future. Can the United States and China cooperate on global challenges, or will rivalry dominate? Issues like climate change, pandemics, cybersecurity, and advanced technology development require collaboration. For example, both countries have a responsibility to reduce carbon emissions and invest in renewable energy, because climate change affects the entire planet. Similarly, technological innovation in fields like artificial intelligence, semiconductors, and 5G networks benefits from international cooperation. However, mistrust, competition, and strategic interests make collaboration difficult.
Exactly. Cooperation is possible, but it requires mutual trust, clear agreements, and shared goals. The trade war illustrated that when competition dominates, even necessary collaboration can be delayed or undermined. On the other hand, some level of competition may be healthy, encouraging innovation, efficiency, and strategic planning. The challenge for the global community is finding the right balance between cooperation and competition, ensuring that rivalry does not harm global stability, while also encouraging countries to improve their own capabilities and industries.
For English learners, this discussion introduces important vocabulary about economics, trade, and diplomacy. Words like interdependence, nationalism, globalization, collaboration, innovation, tariffs, and supply chain are frequently used when discussing international relations and global markets. Understanding these terms helps learners not only improve language skills, but also engage with real-world issues that shape economies and politics. Using them in context, as we are doing, makes the vocabulary easier to remember and apply.
Another important lesson is that global challenges require both leadership and compromise. No single country can solve issues like climate change or cybersecurity alone. The trade war showed that rivalry can slow progress, while dialogue and negotiation can create solutions. Both the US and China have unique strengths. America has advanced technology, financial power, and global influence, while China has manufacturing capacity, investment capabilities, and growing innovation in science and technology. Combining these strengths through cooperation could address global problems more effectively than rivalry alone.
It is also essential to think about long-term consequences. The trade war may have short-term goals, like reducing a trade deficit or protecting jobs, but long-term strategies require thinking about global stability, growth, and innovation. Countries, businesses, and individuals must consider not only immediate gains, but also how their decisions influence relationships, supply chains, and global development for decades. In this sense, the lessons of the trade war are not limited to economics. They extend to diplomacy, education, technology, and environmental policy.
Yes, and learners of English can see that discussing international issues involves combining language skills with critical thinking. When we talk about cooperation, competition, interdependence, or globalization, we are not just learning new words. We are learning to understand how the world works and how decisions in one country can affect millions of people globally. This connection between vocabulary and real-world issues is what makes learning English meaningful, practical, and exciting.
In conclusion, the trade war teaches us that the future of global relations depends on balance. Competition can drive progress, innovation, and economic growth, but unchecked rivalry may create tension, instability, and inefficiency. Cooperation, on the other hand, can solve shared challenges and enhance global welfare, but it requires trust, dialogue, and mutual respect. For countries, businesses, and individuals, understanding these dynamics is essential to making informed decisions and adapting to a changing world.
Finally, English learners should take note that words like cooperation, competition, negotiation, alliance, and interdependence are not abstract terms. They describe real actions and strategies that shape global events. By learning and using these terms in context, you not only improve your English, but also develop a better understanding of international relations, economics, and diplomacy, knowledge that is valuable in today's interconnected world.
As we reach the final section of our discussion, it is clear that China's rise and America's long-standing dominance are reshaping the 21st century. The trade war, technological competition, and global reactions all highlight the complexity of modern international relations. The world is no longer divided by simple borders or isolated economies. Instead, nations are interconnected through trade, technology, finance, and shared global challenges. Understanding these connections is not just for politicians or economists. It is valuable for anyone who wants to make sense of today's rapidly changing world.
Exactly, Adam. For English learners, following this discussion helps in more ways than one. You are not only improving your vocabulary in economics, trade, and diplomacy, but also gaining insight into real-world events that shape global society. Terms like tariffs, innovation, interdependence, and globalization are more than words. They are tools to understand how countries interact and make decisions that affect millions of people. Learning English through such topics allows students to engage with knowledge, think critically, and connect language skills to practical understanding.
China's rise has brought enormous economic growth, technological advancements, and influence in global markets. At the same time, America continues to lead in innovation, finance, and global leadership. The interaction between these two powers creates opportunities and challenges for the rest of the world. It shapes markets, influences policies, and guides investment decisions. For students, workers, and professionals, understanding this dynamic is essential. It shows how economic decisions in one part of the world can affect jobs, prices, and technological progress everywhere.
And it is not only about economics. The trade war and technological competition show that diplomacy, negotiation, and cooperation are equally important. Countries must balance competition with collaboration to address global challenges like climate change, security, and sustainable development. Learning about these issues helps English learners develop critical thinking, awareness of world affairs, and the ability to discuss complex topics with clarity. It shows how knowledge and language combine to open doors to understanding and opportunity.
This also emphasizes the value of education. By studying global economics, politics, and technology, learners can better navigate the modern world. Understanding how tariffs, supply chains, innovation, and interdependence work provides insight into the decisions made by governments and companies. It allows individuals to see the big picture, anticipate changes, and make informed choices. Education and language learning empower people to participate meaningfully in discussions about the global economy and international relations.
Absolutely. And for English learners, the journey does not stop here. Following podcasts, reading news, and discussing global events in English helps improve both language skills and knowledge. It is a way to stay informed, think critically, and engage with the world confidently. Every new word, every concept, and every discussion builds understanding and prepares learners to be active participants in the interconnected global community.
In conclusion, the rise of China and the continued influence of America are shaping our century in profound ways. Understanding these shifts is essential for anyone who wants to grasp how the world works today. The global economic balance affects trade, technology, jobs, and innovation across continents. For English learners, following such topics helps combine language learning with awareness, providing skills that are both practical and intellectually enriching.
Finally, we want to leave our listeners with a positive message. Learning, awareness, and curiosity are invaluable tools in today's interconnected world. By studying economics, technology, and global affairs, all while improving your English, you are preparing yourself for a future full of opportunities. Remember, knowledge empowers, education transforms, and language connects. Stay curious, stay informed, and keep learning. Because understanding the world begins with awareness, and continues with action.
Thank you, dear listeners, for joining us on this deep dive into the US-China trade war, technology competition, and the shifting global economy. Remember, every discussion is an opportunity to learn, improve your English, and gain insight into the world around you.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the English Globe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you are listening from and what you think about the global economic changes we discussed today. Your participation makes this learning journey richer and more exciting.